Hi, my name is Eve Kostimich, and today I'm going to be talking to you about open source. The idea of open source has existed for many years. When automobiles were first developed, a group of capital monopolists owned the rights to the two-cycle gasoline engine patent. Because of this, the group was able to monopolize the industry and enforce that other car manufacturers adhere to their demands. It wasn't until 1911, when Henry Ford challenged this group and won, that the patent was made accessible to everyone. Henry Ford, in this example, established the concept of open source. Today, we are going to be talking more about this term open source, the open source initiative, some advantages and disadvantages to open source software and programs. Then I will give a real-life example and finally conclude on the topic of open source. Open source is a term that is used when referring to the universal access to a product's design or blueprint. The goal is to create programs and software that can be made accessible to the general public and can be modified from their original design and purpose. Any improvements that might have been made through the use of the product's design or blueprint are also accessible universally. Additionally, the term open source can be applied to a variety of applications. Open source can be applied to computer software, electronics, food and beverages, digital content, medicine, fashion, and much more. Some examples of these applications include Android, Linux, Symbian, Firefox, and Ubuntu. As we can see, it has become more and more common for companies to establish open source policies. Not every product or design that is made accessible to everyone can be considered open source. A certification must be issued by the Open Source Initiative in order for a design or program to be considered open source. There are many qualifications that must be met, and the Open Source Initiative requires that they be met so that there's a standard and expectation set for all open source programs. Next, we are going to take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of open source. This picture gives an overview to what we'll be talking about. The advantages are listed on the left, and the disadvantages are listed on the right. We'll first start by talking about the advantages and then move on to talking about the disadvantages of open source programs and softwares. There are many benefits to open source programs and designs. First, we will look at the quality aspects of open source. Second, we will look at the role of customizability. And lastly, we will look at the cost savings associated with open source programs and softwares. First, the quality of programs and softwares created by using open source will increase. This is because programs and software created by thousands of developers are much better than when created by only a handful of developers. Therefore, the quality of the programs and software developed will only continue to improve. Additionally, customizability is a huge advantage to open source software and programs. Users can create programs from open source software and customize those programs to their specific needs. This means more and more programs and softwares will be designed with the consumers in mind. Lastly, the low cost of open source softwares and programs make it advantageous. The Open Source Initiative ensures that open source projects are free from any royalties and fees. Therefore, open source is advantageous because it cuts the cost of developing a software from the ground up. As we can see in this image, lower upfront costs on the left will lead to increased savings on the right. While there are many proponents for open source software and programs, there are a couple disadvantages. First, we will look at the lack of user-friendliness in open source programs and softwares. Second, we will look at the minimal profits that developers can make off of these open source softwares and programs and how that affects them. First, open source software and programs are sometimes not the most user-friendly. This is because less time may be spent on developing the user interface. This makes certain programs and softwares not as easy to use. Therefore, this aspect of open source is extremely disadvantageous to users of those programs and softwares. Additionally, profiting from open source software can be a challenge. This is because the open source license requires that any additional work done to the software or program be freely distributed as well. Therefore, it is difficult for a profit to be made because any profits have the potential of being taken away. Overall, as we can see, the advantages to open source outweigh the disadvantages, and in the future, it is likely that more companies will establish open source policies. A real-life example of open source can be seen through the electric car company Tesla. In 2014, Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, announced that the company would release their patents. In a statement made, Musk says that technology leadership is not defined by patents, but rather the ability of a company to attract and motivate the world's most talented engineers. The goal of Tesla's open source policy is to combat climate change by encouraging other companies to develop and build electric cars. This example illustrates that through the use of open source, developers and businesses can come together to solve greater issues in our world, just as Tesla has done with climate change. As we saw on the previous slide, there is a bright future for open source. More and more companies have adopted open source policies, and this will only continue in future years. Additionally, these open source software and programs could change the world we live in. In 2014, a survey was done that projected open source software trends. It was expected by 2015 that there would be 100 billion lines of code for 10 million people, and that this would only increase in following years. This is because more and more companies have begun to realize the importance of open source. And as the number of companies increases, so will the amount that establish open source policies. In conclusion, open source programs and softwares have revolutionized the world we live in. These open source policies can be used so that real-world problems such as climate change are addressed. Overall, the open source field has endless possibilities and will only continue to expand in the future. Thank you for watching my presentation on open source. I hope that you gained valuable information on what open source is, noted the disadvantages and advantages to open source programs and softwares, and have realized the importance of this field in the future and the role that it will play.